the Flannan Isles Lighthouse Mystery. 3 men who vanished into thin air December the 26th, 1900, Boxing Day. The lighthouse tender ship Hesperus was making its way through the cold waters of the North Atlantic toward a remote cluster of islands 20 miles west of the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. These islands, the Flannan Isles, were desolate, treeless rocks beaten constantly by waves and wind, home to nothing but seabirds and one structure, a lighthouse built just 1 year earlier on the largest island, Eilean Mor. As the Hesperus approached, the crew raised a flag to signal their arrival. There was no response. They sounded the horn, a long blast that should have brought the lighthouse keepers running. Silence. They fired a rocket flare into the gray December sky. Still nothing. An uneasy feeling settled over the men aboard the Hesperus. Something was wrong. Joseph Moore, the relief lighthouse keeper who was aboard the ship, climbed into a small boat and was rowed to the island's east landing. He made his way up the steep path, 160 stone steps leading to the lighthouse compound. The entrance gate was closed. The main door was shut but unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside, calling out. No answer. What Moore found inside that lighthouse would launch one of the most enduring mysteries in maritime history. 3 experienced lighthouse keepers, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, had vanished. Not a single trace of them remained, except for the eerie signs of their abrupt departure. The kitchen clock had stopped. The beds were unmade. A chair was overturned. But most disturbing, 2 sets of oilskins, the waterproof coats essential for going outside in harsh weather, were missing. The 3rd set hung on its hook, as if one of the 3 men had gone outside in the middle of winter without protection from the elements. No bodies were ever found. No explanation was ever proven. And for over 120 years, the question has haunted Scotland and captivated the world. What happened to the 3 lighthouse keepers of Flannan Isle? This is the true story of a mystery that has inspired poems, songs, films, conspiracy theories, and endless speculation. A story where the facts are stranger than any fiction invented to explain them. To understand what happened, or what might have happened, we need to understand the Flannan Isles themselves. This wasn't just any remote location. This was a place with a dark reputation long before the lighthouse was ever built. The Flannan Isles are a group of small, rocky islands in the Outer Hebrides, approximately 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis, Scotland's northernmost major island. The largest of these islands, Eilean Mor, meaning Big Island in Gaelic, rises from the sea with steep cliffs and treacherous rocks. There are no trees, no natural harbor, no fresh water source beyond what rain provides. The weather is brutal, fierce Atlantic storms regularly battering the exposed rocks with waves that can reach terrifying heights. The islands are named after Saint Flannan, a 7th century Irish bishop who supposedly built a small chapel on Eilean Mor. For centuries, the islands remained largely uninhabited, though local shepherds occasionally brought sheep to graze there during summer months. But they never stayed overnight. Never. Local folklore insisted the islands were haunted, that malevolent spirits dwelled there, that terrible things happened to those who remained after dark. The islands had other names too, the 7 Hunters, though why they were called this is unclear. Some legends spoke of 7 hunters who were turned to stone for hunting on the Sabbath, their petrified forms becoming the 7 main islands of the group. Whether you believe in spirits or not, the the Flannan Isles had a reputation. They were a place to be feared, a place where the boundary between the natural and supernatural seemed thin. Sailors gave them wide berth when possible. Those who had to pass them at night looked for the reassuring beam of a lighthouse, knowing it meant someone was there, keeping watch, holding back whatever darkness the islands might harbor. And in 1899, that lighthouse became reality. The Northern Lighthouse Board, responsible for maintaining navigational lights around Scotland, had recognized for years that the Flannan Isles needed a lighthouse. Ships regularly passed through these waters, and the islands, invisible on dark nights, posed a deadly hazard. Between 1895 and 1899, construction crews worked under brutal conditions to build a lighthouse on Isle Moor. Every stone, every piece of equipment, every bag of cement had to be hauled up 150-foot cliffs directly from supply boats. A railway track was built, its cars hauled by cables, to transport materials from the landings to the lighthouse at the island's highest point. The lighthouse was designed by David Allen Stevenson, member of the famous Stevenson family of lighthouse engineers. It was a substantial structure, 75 feet tall, built to withstand the worst weather the Atlantic could throw at it. The light was first lit on December 7th, 1899, casting its beam across the dark waters, a symbol of human triumph over one of nature's most hostile environments. The lighthouse required a crew of 3 keepers who would live on the island for weeks at a time, with a 4th keeper rotating from shore. Every 2 weeks, weather permitting, a relief vessel would arrive with supplies and swap out 1 keeper. It was isolating, demanding work, but lighthouse keepers were experienced men, accustomed to solitude, knowledgeable about the sea and its dangers. The keepers stationed at Flannan were no different. James Ducat was the principal keeper, the man in charge. At 43 years old, he was married with 4 children, a steady, reliable man from Leith who had worked as a lighthouse keeper for years. He was known for being calm under pressure, methodical in his duties. Fellow keepers described him as quiet, thoughtful, the kind of man who smoked his pipe while watching the sea, rarely speaking unless he had something important to say. Thomas Marshall was 28 years old, the second assistant keeper. He was younger, less experienced than Ducat, but competent and eager. He had been fined 5 shillings earlier in his career for losing equipment in a storm, a significant sum for a working man in 1900. This fine would later become important when investigators tried to understand what might have driven the men to leave the safety of the lighthouse during dangerous conditions. Donald MacArthur, 40 years old, was the occasional keeper, filling in temporarily for William Ross, the first assistant, who was on sick leave. MacArthur was a substitute, but he was no amateur. He was an experienced seaman, a large, strong man known on the Scottish mainland as something of a brawler when he'd had too much to drink. But he was also a family man, married with children, considered reliable enough to be entrusted with the critical work of keeping the light burning. These were the 3 men stationed on Isle Moor in December 1900. Experienced, competent, not the type to panic or make foolish decisions, which makes what happened to them all the more inexplicable. The first sign that something was wrong came on December 15th, 1900. The steamship Arctur, sailing from Philadelphia to Leith in Scotland, passed the Flannan Isles around midnight. The captain noted in the ship's log that the lighthouse was dark. This was unusual, but not necessarily alarming. Technical problems could cause temporary outages. But when the Arctur docked in Leith 3 days later, the captain mentioned the dark lighthouse to port authorities, who passed the information to the Northern Lighthouse Board. The board decided to send the relief vessel Hesperus to investigate, but bad weather delayed the journey. The ship was originally scheduled to depart on December 20th, but storms kept it in port. For 6 days, while the Hesperus sat unable to sail, whatever had happened on Flannan Isle remained undiscovered. Finally, on December 26th, Boxing Day, the weather cleared enough for the Hesperus to make the crossing. Captain James Harvey commanded the vessel, and aboard was Joseph Moore, the relief keeper who was supposed to rotate in and allow one of the 3 men on the island to return to shore for his time off. As they approached Islean Moor that cold afternoon, they followed the standard procedure, raising a flag, sounding the horn, sending up a rocket flare. These were signals the keepers should have recognized immediately, bringing them down to the landing to assist with unloading supplies and preparing for the relief rotation. But there was no response. No figures appeared on the landing. No answering signal came from the lighthouse. Joseph Moore volunteered to go ashore alone to investigate. He was rowed to the east, landing in a small boat, climbed out onto the rocks, and began making his way up the steep stone steps toward the lighthouse. With each step, his unease must have grown. The silence was wrong. By now, someone should have appeared. Something was very wrong. The entrance gate to the lighthouse compound was closed. Moore opened it and continued to the main door. It too was closed, but unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside, calling out the names of his colleagues. "Hello, Ducat, Marshall, MacArthur," his voice echoed in the empty lighthouse. No answer came. Moore began searching the lighthouse systematically, and what he found was a scene that would be analyzed, debated, and embellished for over a century. The kitchen was tidy, but abandoned. The table was cleared. Utensils had been washed and put away. A chair was overturned on the floor, as if someone had stood up quickly or been startled. The clock on the wall had stopped, its hands showing a time approximately a week in the eos past. The beds in the sleeping quarters were unmade, suggesting the men had not spent the previous night there, or at least had not made their beds that morning. The lamp room at the top of the lighthouse showed that the lamp had been cleaned and prepared for lighting, but never lit. The oil was full, the glass polished, everything ready for another night of service, but the light had never been ignited. The logbook showed that the last official entries were from December 13th, but on a slate board where keepers would jot down information before transferring it to the official log, there were entries dated December 14th and December 15th, including weather observations taken at 9 a.m. on December 15th. These entries showed normal barometric pressure, wind readings, and other meteorological data. The entries suggested that the morning work of December 15th had been completed as usual. Whatever happened in the afternoon of December 15th. Moore checked the storage areas. Food supplies were normal. Equipment was in its proper place. Then he checked the oilskins, the heavy waterproof coats that keepers wore when venturing outside in wet weather. 2 were missing. 1 remained, hanging on its hook. This detail would become one of the most puzzling aspects of the entire mystery. If 2 men had gone outside, they had taken their oilskins, which made sense. But if the 3rd man had followed them, or gone out separately, why had he left his oilskin behind? December in the Scottish Islands is cold, wet, and brutal. No experienced keeper would venture out without protection, yet apparently one had. Moore ran back down to the landing and signaled the Hesperus. The lighthouse was empty. The keepers were gone. Captain Harvey immediately sent 2 more men ashore, the buoymaster Joseph MacDonald and seaman Donald Campbell, both of whom volunteered to help search the island. They scoured Island Moor from top to bottom, calling out, checking every building, every crevice, every cliff edge. They found nothing, no bodies, no signs of a struggle, no evidence of what had happened to 3 grown men. But they did find something disturbing at the island's west landing, the secondary access point on the opposite side of the island from where they had landed. The west landing had been severely damaged. Iron railings were bent and twisted. A wooden box stored at a secure location 110 feet above sea level had been smashed open, its contents scattered. Heavy iron railway equipment used for hauling supplies had been torn from its concrete moorings and twisted. Ropes were tangled and damaged. The destruction suggested tremendous force, as if a massive wave had surged up the cliff face far higher than should have been possible. Captain Harvey, seeing no other option and needing to keep the light operational, left Joseph Moore and 3 volunteers on the island to maintain the lighthouse while the Hesperus returned to port. Harvey immediately sent a telegram to the Northern Lighthouse Board that would become one of the most famous messages in maritime history. A dreadful accident has happened at Flannan's. The 3 keepers, Ducat, Marshall, and the Occasional, have disappeared from the island. On our arrival there this afternoon, no sign of life was to be seen on the island. Fired a rocket, but, as no response was made, managed to land Moore, who went up to the station but found no keepers there. The clocks were stopped, and other signs indicated that the accident must have happened about a week ago. Poor fellows, they must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure a crane or something like that. Night coming on, we could not wait to make something as to their fate. I have left Moore, MacDonald, buoymaster, and 2 seamen on the island to keep the light burning until you make other arrangements. The Northern Lighthouse Board immediately launched an investigation. Robert Muirhead, the board superintendent, knew all 3 missing men personally. He had recruited them, trusted them, worked with them. He traveled to Flannan Isle to conduct his own examination of the scene. Muirhead's investigation confirmed everything Moore had reported. He examined the damaged west landing, noting the force required to cause such destruction. He studied the logbook and the slate board. He looked at the missing oilskins and tried to reconstruct what might have happened. His official conclusion, issued in the final report, was straightforward. The evidence pointed to an accident. Muirhead theorized that on the afternoon of December 15th, Marshall and Ducat, wearing their oilskins, had gone down to the west landing to secure equipment that had been damaged or loosened by recent storms. While they were there, an enormous wave, what sailors call a rogue wave or a sneaker wave, had surged up the cliff face and swept both men into the sea. MacArthur, waiting in the lighthouse according to standard protocol that at least 1 keeper must remain inside, eventually grew concerned when his colleagues didn't return. He rushed out without his oilskin to investigate and was also caught by a wave and swept away. This theory explained most of the evidence. It explained the missing oilskins. It explained the damage to the west landing. It explained why all 3 men disappeared. It was plausible, and it became the official explanation. But even from the beginning, there were problems with this explanation. Problems that have kept the mystery alive for over 120 years. First, the weather. The official meteorological records for December 15, 1900, show that weather in the region was relatively calm. There were no storms recorded. The Isle of Lewis, just 20 miles away, had clear enough weather that observers there noted the lighthouse was not operating, which means visibility was good. How could there be calm weather generally, but a massive rogue wave at Flannan Isles specifically? Defenders of the official theory point out that the Flannan Isles create their own weather. The islands sit exposed in the Atlantic, and local conditions can be far worse than regional weather. A storm could batter Flannan while Lewis remained calm. Furthermore, rogue waves are, by definition, unpredictable. They can appear even in relatively calm seas, massive swells that surge up without warning. But there's another problem. The slate board showed that weather observations were taken at 9 a.m. on December 15th and recorded as normal. If storms were bad enough to generate waves that could surge 110 feet up a cliff face, surely those conditions would have been present in the morning and noted in the weather observations. The entries on the slate suggest the morning was calm, which means any catastrophic wave would have had to occur suddenly in the afternoon with no advance warning. Then there's the question of the logbook itself. And this is where the mystery takes a darker turn, because not everyone believes the logbook found at the lighthouse tells the whole story. Shortly after the disappearances, rumors began circulating about entries in the logbook that were far stranger than anyone initially reported. These rumors claimed that in the days before December 15th, the keepers had written increasingly disturbed entries describing a terrible storm, far worse than anything they had experienced before. According to these rumors, Marshall had written that Ducat was unusually quiet, that MacArthur, a tough, weathered seaman known for brawling, had been crying, and that all three men had been praying for deliverance. The final rumored entry, supposedly written on December 15th, stated, "Storm ended, sea calm, God is over all." These entries, if they existed, would completely change the understanding of what happened. They would suggest the men were experiencing something that terrified them, something beyond normal weather. They would suggest psychological distress in the days before the disappearance. But here's the crucial detail. These logbook entries never existed. They were fabricated, invented years after the event, likely by writers and journalists looking to sensationalize the story. Multiple investigations, including access to the actual logbook, have confirmed that no such entries were ever written. The real logbook shows routine, professional entries up until December 13th, and nothing unusual on the slate for December 14th and 15th. So why do these fake entries persist in the mythology of the Flannan Isles? Because they make a better story, because they add an element of psychological horror that the mundane explanation of a rogue wave doesn't provide. Because people want the mystery to be strange, want there to be something inexplicable, want the disappearance to be more than just a tragic accident. But even setting aside the fabricated entries, even accepting that the official explanation is probably correct, questions remain. Questions that nag at anyone who studies this case closely. Why did MacArthur go outside without his oilskin? Standard lighthouse protocol required at least one keeper to remain inside at all times. If Marshall and Ducat went to the West Landing, MacArthur should have stayed put. Even if he became concerned, even if hours passed with no return, an experienced keeper would know to take precautions before venturing out. The weather might have been calm at 9 a.m., but December afternoons in the Scottish Islands can turn brutal in minutes. Why rush out without proper gear? One explanation is time pressure. Perhaps MacArthur saw from the lighthouse window that something was wrong. Perhaps he saw a wave take his colleagues and ran out immediately to try to help, knowing every second mattered. But if he saw them swept away, why would he run toward the same danger that had just killed them? Another explanation involves Marshall's previous fine for losing equipment. Marshall had been fined 5 shillings for equipment loss during a storm, a substantial sum for a working man. 5 shillings might not sound like much today, but for a lighthouse keeper in 1900, with a family to support, it was nearly a week's wages. If equipment at the West Landing was in danger of being damaged or lost, Marshall would have been highly motivated to secure it, even in marginal conditions. Ducat, as principal keeper, would have gone with him. And if something went wrong, if both men were taken by a wave, MacArthur might have acted impulsively, running out in a desperate attempt at rescue without thinking about his own safety. This explanation makes psychological sense. It accounts for why the men might have taken risks. But it still requires accepting that 3 experienced men who knew the sea intimately, who had survived other storms and other dangers, all made fatal errors on the same afternoon. And there's one more detail that troubles those who study this case. The chair. In the kitchen, a chair was overturned. Such a small detail, almost irrelevant, but it nags. If the men were calmly going about their work, preparing to go to the West Landing to check equipment, why is a chair overturned? Did someone stand up quickly? Was there a sudden alarm? Did they see something that caused one of them to jump up, knocking over the chair in the process? Or is the overturned chair nothing? A trivial detail that means nothing, the sort of minor disorder that can exist in any lived-in space. Alternative theories have emerged over the decades, each attempting to explain what the official report cannot. The murder-suicide theory suggests that MacArthur, known for his temper and history of brawling, got into a fight with one or both of the other keepers. Perhaps an argument escalated. Perhaps MacArthur killed Ducat and Marshall in a rage. Then, horrified by what he'd done, threw himself off the cliffs. This theory explains why all 3 men disappeared and why there was damage at the West Landing. MacArthur could have dragged bodies there or created the damage deliberately to stage an accident scene. But this theory has significant problems. First, there's no evidence of violence in the lighthouse. No blood, no signs of struggle, no damage to furniture beyond the overturned chair. Second, if MacArthur killed the others, why would he then leave the lighthouse? Why not stay, claim it was an accident, or simply wait to be found? Third, the personalities don't fit. While MacArthur had a reputation for fighting when drunk, lighthouse keepers lived in enforced sobriety. Alcohol was strictly forbidden at lighthouses. 3 sober men, isolated together, with no apparent history of conflict, suddenly erupting into murderous violence seems implausible. The abduction theory suggests that someone came to the island, perhaps by boat, and took the 3 men by force, either for ransom or for darker purposes. This theory gained some traction during World War I, when fears of foreign spies were heightened. Perhaps German agents had abducted the keepers. Perhaps they were involved in espionage in some way. But this theory collapses under scrutiny. There's no evidence of any boat having landed on the island. The lighthouse was visible from Lewis, and any unusual vessel activity likely would have been noticed. More importantly, why abduct 3 lighthouse keepers? They had no political importance, no valuable information. And if the abduction was for ransom, why was no ransom demand ever made? The supernatural theories, of course, persist. Local folklore had long claimed the Flannan Isles were haunted. Perhaps ancient spirits had taken the men. Perhaps the malevolent forces that locals had feared for centuries finally claimed victims. The legend of the Phantom of the Seven Hunters was particularly popular in the years after the disappearance. This was supposedly a ghost ship, crewed by malevolent spirits that roamed the waters around the Flannan Isles, luring men to their deaths. Had the phantom ship come for the keepers? Then there were tales of sea serpents, of giant creatures from the deep rising up to snatch men from the rocks, or of selkies, seal people from Scottish mythology, who supposedly inhabited the islands and did not take kindly to human presence. These supernatural explanations, while entertaining, obviously lack evidence. They're the products of a culture that saw the world through a lens of folklore and superstition. But they persist because the Flannan Isles Mystery feels like it should have a supernatural explanation. The setting is so remote, so hostile, so steeped in local legends that a prosaic explanation feels insufficient. Later lighthouse keepers stationed at Flannan Isle after the tragedy reported their own unsettling experiences. Some claimed to hear voices in the wind, calling out the names of the 3 dead men. Others reported feeling watched, sensing presences that shouldn't be there. A few abandoned their posts, unable to cope with the isolation and the weight of what had happened there. Are these reports evidence of genuine supernatural activity? Or are they the predictable psychological responses of isolated men living in a place with a dark history where every sound of wind and wave can be interpreted as something more sinister? Modern analysis of the mystery tends to favor the official explanation with some modifications. The most detailed reconstruction suggests this sequence of events. On the afternoon of December 15th, after completing morning duties and having lunch, Ducat and Marshall, wearing their oilskins, went down to the West Landing to inspect and secure equipment. The weather was not stormy, but the sea was running high, perhaps due to distant weather systems that didn't affect the local area, but created large swells. These swells, combined with the specific geography of the West Landing, created conditions where a large wave could surge up the cliff face. While Ducat and Marshall were at the landing, a rogue wave, far larger than the others, surged up and caught them. They were swept into the sea. MacArthur, watching from the lighthouse, saw what happened. He ran out immediately, not thinking about his oilskin, not thinking about protocol, thinking only of trying to save his colleagues. He rushed down to the West Landing, and either the same wave caught him, or another wave arrived as he reached the rocks, sweeping him away as well. This reconstruction accounts for most of the evidence. It explains the missing oilskins. It explains MacArthur venturing out without protection. It explains the damage to the West Landing. It fits with the physical evidence and the timeline established by the slateboard entries. But it requires accepting several things. That 3 experienced men were all caught by the same freak occurrence, that no bodies ever washed ashore or were found despite the relatively enclosed geography of the islands, and that the wave was powerful enough to cause extensive damage to infrastructure, but left no other trace beyond the destruction at the landing. It's possible. Rogue waves are real and terrifying phenomena. They can appear without warning, reaching heights far beyond normal waves. There are documented cases of rogue waves sweeping people off rocks and piers, even in seemingly calm conditions. The force of water at such scales can be unimaginable, capable of bending iron, smashing concrete, and certainly capable of killing 3 men. And yet, And yet there's something about the Flannan Isles Mystery that resists complete resolution. The combination of the remote setting, the complete disappearance of 3 experienced men, the minor details that don't quite fit, the local legends and subsequent reports of strange experiences all combine to create a mystery that feels like it should be more than just a terrible accident. Perhaps that's the real lesson of Flannan Isle. Sometimes terrible things happen for mundane reasons. Sometimes experienced, competent people make small errors that cascade into tragedy. Sometimes the sea, which gives no warning and offers no mercy, simply takes what it wants. The lighthouse at Flannan Isle continued to operate for decades after the 1900 tragedy, though it gained a dark reputation. Keepers assigned there knew the story, knew that 3 of their predecessors had vanished without trace. Some requested transfers. Others refused assignments there altogether. But the light continued to burn, as it had to, guiding ships safely past the dangerous rocks. In 1971, the lighthouse was automated. Technology finally made it possible to maintain the light without human keepers permanently stationed on the island. Today, Eilean Moor is uninhabited once again, as it was for centuries before the lighthouse was built. The lighthouse still stands, still operates, but no one lives there. No one maintains it beyond occasional visits by technicians. The islands have returned to their isolation, home only to seabirds and memories. The story of the vanished keepers has inspired countless works of art. Wilfred Wilson Gibson wrote a famous poem, Flannan Isle, in 1912, just 12 years after the disappearance. His poem, though factually inaccurate, captured the eerie quality of the mystery and helped cement it in popular imagination. The rock band Genesis wrote and recorded The Mystery of the Flannan Isle Lighthouse in 1968. The Scottish composer Peter Maxwell Davies created a chamber opera, The Lighthouse, in 1979, exploring possible psychological explanations for what might have happened. The Doctor Who serial horror of Fang Rock drew inspiration from the mystery. And in 2018, the film The Vanishing, starring Gerard Butler, offered a fictional take on the events, imagining a scenario involving murder, madness, and moral decay among isolated men. Each retelling adds new layers, new speculation, new theories. Some stay closer to the known facts. Others venture into pure fiction. But all share a common recognition that there's something compelling about this mystery, something that speaks to deep human fears about isolation, the power of nature, and the fragility of human life in hostile environments. For the families of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, the artistic interpretations and endless speculation must have been painful. These weren't characters in a story. They were real men, husbands and fathers, who went to work one day and never came home. Their families never had bodies to bury, never had definitive answers about what happened in those final moments, never had closure. The wives of the 3 men received pensions from the Northern Lighthouse Board, a recognition that their husbands had died in service. But money couldn't replace the men themselves, couldn't answer the questions the children must have asked. What happened to Papa? Where did he go? Why didn't he come home? Today, if you visit the Flannan Isles, you can see the lighthouse standing on Eilean Moor's highest point. The climb up from the landing is still treacherous, the stone steps slick with spray and bird droppings. The wind still howls around the rocks. The sea still crashes against the cliffs with the same force that may have killed 3 men over a century ago. The lighthouse is closed to casual visitors, automated and unstaffed. but occasionally researchers, historians, or television crews are granted permission to visit. Those who have been there report that the island has a presence, an atmosphere that's difficult to describe. Some call it eerie, others say melancholy. A few have claimed to feel genuine fear, though they can't articulate why. Is this atmosphere real, some quality of the place itself? Or is it psychological, the product of knowing the history, of standing in a location where tragedy occurred, of feeling the isolation and hostility of the environment? Probably the latter. But when the wind picks up, when the waves crash particularly hard, when the gray Scottish sky presses down and the lighthouse stands alone on its barren rock, it's easy to understand why locals believed the islands were haunted. It's easy to imagine three men, over a century ago, facing something they couldn't survive. And it's easy to wonder if we'll ever truly know what happened in those final moments. The mystery of the Flannan Isles Lighthouse stands as one of history's most compelling unsolved disappearances. Not because it's likely to have a dramatic or sinister explanation, the official theory of a terrible accident is probably correct, but because it demonstrates how, even in the modern world, even with investigations and evidence and logical reasoning, some questions remain unanswered. Some losses remain unexplained. Some mysteries, quietly and disturbingly, remain mysteries. 3 men vanished on December 15th, 1900. The lighthouse went dark, and when the light was relit, when new keepers took up residence in that isolated tower, the ghosts of Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur remained. Not literally, perhaps, but in memory, in legend, in the enduring question that echoes across 120 years. What really happened on Flannan Isle? We'll likely never know for certain. The sea keeps its secrets, the dead cannot speak, and the Flannan Isles, remote and windswept, stand as they always have, indifferent to human questions, untouched by human need for closure, forever holding whatever truth they witnessed on that cold December afternoon when 3 experienced lighthouse keepers walked out of their tower and never returned.